Every morning, Gaius held a razor to Caesar's throat, thinking he had the most trusted job in Rome. What he didn't know was that imperial barbers had the shortest life expectancy in the palace, because the man who held steel to the emperor's neck was always one whispered secret away from having his own throat cut. Welcome to Whispers of History. Before we begin this incredible story of Gaius, whose steady hands once held steel to the throat of the most powerful man in the ancient world, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you believe that trust can be more dangerous than betrayal. Hit that subscribe button and share this story to help us honor those who served in the shadows of absolute power. The marble floors of the Palatine Hill gleamed like mirrors in the early morning light as Gaius Antonius carefully arranged his tools in the emperor's private chambers. His hands, steady as a surgeon's, laid out each implement with the precision of a ritual. The bronze razor with its ivory handle, the pumice stone for smoothing rough skin, the silver basin filled with warm water, scented with lavender and rosemary, and the collection of oils imported from the farthest reaches of the empire. It was the 3rd year of Emperor Commodus's reign, and Gaius had been the imperial barber for exactly 18 months. 18 months of what he believed was the most prestigious position a freeman could hold in Rome. Every morning, he alone was granted access to the most powerful man in the known world. He alone was trusted to hold a blade to the throat of Caesar. He alone knew the emperor's most private habits, his fears whispered in moments of vulnerability, his plans spoken carelessly during the intimacy of grooming. What Gaius didn't know, what no one had bothered to tell him when he accepted the position, was that he was the 7th imperial barber in the past 5 years. The previous 6 had all met mysterious ends. Lucius had supposedly fallen down the palace steps after drinking too much wine. Those servants whispered that his neck showed marks that looked suspiciously like fingerprints. Marcus had allegedly died of a sudden fever, though his wife found poison residue in his favorite wine cup. Brutus had apparently been killed by robbers on his way home from the palace, though nothing had been stolen and the wounds were too precise, too professional for common bandits. The pattern should have been obvious, but the palace staff had learned long ago that asking too many questions about the fate of their predecessors was the quickest way to join them in whatever afterlife awaited servants who knew too much. Gaius had been chosen for the position through what seemed like divine providence. He had been working as a barber in the Suburra, the rough district where he had grown up, when a well-dressed stranger had appeared at his shop. The man had watched Gaius work, observe his technique, and noted his steady hands and attention to detail. Within a week, Gaius found himself summoned to the palace for an interview with the imperial chamberlain. The interview had been brief and peculiar. Instead of asking about his experience or his references, the chamberlain had focused on more personal matters. Did Gaius have family in Rome? A wife? Children? Close friends? When Gaius admitted that he was essentially alone in the world, his parents dead, no siblings, no romantic attachments, the chamberlain had smiled with what seemed like satisfaction. "Excellent," the man had said. "The emperor values discretion above all else. A man with few attachments is less likely to share confidences inappropriately." Gaius had interpreted this as a sign that he was being trusted with state secrets, that his position would bring him into the inner circle of imperial power. He hadn't realized that men with few attachments were also less likely to be missed when they disappeared. The job had seemed perfect from the beginning. His quarters in the palace were luxurious beyond anything he had experienced in his 30 years of life. Marble floors, painted walls depicting scenes from mythology, a comfortable bed with silk sheets, and access to baths that rivaled those of the wealthy patricians. His salary was more than generous, enough to support a small family in comfort, though of course he had no family to support. More importantly, he had what seemed like unlimited access to the emperor himself. Every morning at dawn, Gaius would be summoned to the imperial chambers to perform his duties. Commodus, despite his reputation for cruelty and excess, had always been courteous to his barber, sometimes even friendly. He would chat about gladiatorial games, discuss his plans for new building projects, or complain about the tedium of governing the empire. These conversations had made Gaius feel important, valued, trusted. He began to think of himself not just as a servant, but as a confidant, perhaps even a friend to the most powerful man in the world. He started to believe that his position was secure, that his skill and discretion had earned him a permanent place in the imperial household. He was wrong. The first sign that something was amiss came during his 15th month of service. Gaius had been shaving the emperor as usual, carefully drawing the blade along Commodus's jaw, when the emperor suddenly stiffened. Through the polished bronze mirror that Gaius held for him, the emperor was watching the doorway to his private chambers. "Someone is listening," Commodus whispered, so quietly that Gaius barely heard him. Gaius glanced toward the doorway, but saw nothing. The corridor beyond appeared empty, though he could hear the distant sounds of the palace awakening, servants beginning their daily tasks, guards changing shifts, the echo of footsteps on marble floors. "I see no one, Caesar," Gaius replied softly, continuing his work with practiced precision. "Not with your eyes," Commodus said, his voice carrying a note of paranoia that Gaius had never heard before. "But they are there. They are always there, watching, waiting, planning." Gaius finished the shaving in silence, applying oil to soothe the emperor's skin and carefully cleaning his tools. But as he prepared to leave, Commodus grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Tell me, Gaius," the emperor said, his eyes boring into the barber's face, "if someone offered you gold to betray me, what would you do?" The question was so unexpected, so jarring, that Gaius almost dropped his razor case. "Caesar, I would never." "Answer the question," Commodus interrupted, his grip tightening. "If someone offered you enough gold to live like a patrician for the rest of your life, would you take it?" Gaius met the emperor's gaze steadily. "My loyalty is to you, Caesar. No amount of gold could buy what you have already given me: purpose, honor, a place of trust in your household." Commodus studied his face for a long moment, then released his wrist. "Good. Remember those words, Gaius. Your life may depend on them." As Gaius left the imperial chambers that morning, he tried to dismiss the emperor's behavior as the product of too much wine the night before, or perhaps stress from the burdens of ruling an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates. But the encounter had planted a seed of unease in his mind, a growing awareness that the palace was not the sanctuary of trust and honor he had imagined. Over the following weeks, Gaius began to notice things he had previously overlooked. The way conversations stopped when he entered a room, the suspicious glances from other servants, the fact that he was never invited to join the casual gatherings of palace staff during their free time. He had attributed this to his elevated position. Perhaps the other servants thought he considered himself above their company. Now he wondered if there was a different reason for their avoidance. The second warning came a month later, during what should have been a routine morning grooming session. Gaius was preparing to trim the emperor's hair when Commodus suddenly stood up from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the Forum Romanum. "Do you know what happened to your predecessor?" the emperor asked without turning around. Gaius's hand stilled on his scissors. "I was told he left to return to his family in the provinces, Caesar." Commodus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Yes, that's what they told you. Just as they told Marcus that Lucius had returned to his family. Just as they told Brutus that Marcus had returned to his family." The emperor turned from the window, and Gaius saw something in his eyes that made his blood turn cold. It wasn't anger or cruelty, emotions he might have expected from a man known for his violent temper. It was pity. "The truth, my loyal Gaius, is that imperial barbers have a tendency to overhear things. Conversations meant for other ears. Plans that must remain secret. And unfortunately, the only way to ensure absolute discretion is absolute silence." Gaius felt his mouth go dry. "Caesar, I have never repeated anything I've heard in your chambers. I would never." "I know," Commodus said gently. "That's what they all said, and I believe they meant it, just as I believe you mean it now. But intention and reality are different things. Men talk, Gaius. They boast to impress women. They share secrets to curry favor with potential patrons. They sell information when times become desperate. It's human nature." The emperor walked back to his chair and sat down, gesturing for Gaius to continue his work. But Gaius's hands were shaking now, and he was afraid to touch the scissors to the emperor's hair. Shall I finish your grooming, Caesar?" "Of course," Commodus said calmly. "We must maintain our routines, mustn't we? Besides, you still have work to do. The question is simply how long that work will continue." Gaius managed to complete the hair trimming without incident, though every snip of the scissors felt like it might be his last. When he finished, the emperor examined his reflection in the bronze mirror and nodded approvingly. "Excellent work as always. You have truly gifted hands, Gaius. It will be a shame to lose them." As Gaius gathered his tools with trembling fingers, he tried to convince himself that the emperor was simply testing his loyalty, trying to frighten him into even greater discretion. But the matter-of-fact tone in Commodus's voice suggested otherwise. This wasn't a threat or a warning. It was a statement of inevitable fact. That night, for the first time since accepting his position, Gaius seriously considered fleeing Rome. He had saved most of his generous salary, and there was enough coin hidden in his quarters to buy passage to Gaul, or perhaps even Britain, where he could disappear into the provinces and resume his former life as a simple barber. But where could he go that the emperor's agents couldn't find him? The Roman Empire stretched across the known world, and Commodus had resources that Gaius couldn't even imagine. More importantly, the very act of fleeing would confirm the emperor's suspicions about his loyalty. If there was any chance of surviving this situation, it lay in continuing to demonstrate his trustworthiness and discretion. So Gaius stayed and continued his morning routine, even as he became increasingly aware of the precariousness of his position. The third warning came in the form of a visitor. Gaius was returning to his quarters after completing the emperor's morning grooming when he found a man waiting in his room. The stranger was well-dressed, but not ostentatiously so, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd in Rome without attracting attention. His age was difficult to determine, somewhere between 30 and 50, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of a hard life despite his current apparent prosperity. "Gaius Antonius," the man said, rising from the chair where he had been waiting. "My name is Quintus Fabius Maximus. I represent certain interests within the empire." Gaius's hand moved instinctively toward the knife. He kept at his belt, but the stranger made no threatening gestures. Instead, he smiled and gestured for Gaius to sit on his own bed. "Please, don't be alarmed. I'm not here to harm you. Quite the opposite, in fact. I'm here to offer you an opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" Gaius asked warily, remaining standing. "The opportunity to live beyond your next birthday," Quintus replied calmly. "Tell me, have you given any thought to your long-term prospects in your current position?" The question was so direct, so precisely focused on Gaius's greatest fear, that he couldn't hide his reaction. Quintus nodded as if his suspicions had been confirmed. "I thought so. You're not the first imperial barber I've had this conversation with, though unfortunately, some of your predecessors were less receptive to my offers." Gaius finally sat down, his legs suddenly weak. "What are you talking about?" "I represent a group of concerned citizens who believe that the current emperor is leading Rome down a dangerous path," Quintus explained. "Commodus's excesses, his neglect of governance, his paranoid elimination of anyone who might pose even a theoretical threat. These behaviors are destroying the empire from within." "That's treason," Gaius whispered. "Is it?" Quintus asked. "Or is it patriotism? When an emperor becomes a threat to Rome itself, Is it not the duty of loyal citizens to act? Gaius shook his head. I won't listen to this. You need to leave. I will, Quintus said, standing up. But first, let me tell you what I can offer you. Safe passage out of Rome, a new identity in the provinces, and enough gold to live comfortably for the rest of your life. All I need in return is information. What kind of information? The Emperor's daily routine. When he's alone, when he's vulnerable, who has access to his private chambers. The kind of details that only someone in your position would know. Gaius stared at the man in horror. You want me to help you assassinate the Emperor? I want you to help us save Rome, Quintus corrected. And in the process, save yourself. Because whether you help us or not, Commodus is going to have you killed. The only question is whether you die as a victim or as a patriot. Quintus moved toward the door, then paused. I'll give you 3 days to consider my offer. After that, the opportunity expires, and you'll be on your own. After the man left, Gaius sat in his room for hours, staring at the painted walls and trying to process what had just happened. He was trapped between two equally terrifying choices: betray the Emperor and become part of an assassination plot, or remain loyal and wait for Commodus to decide he had outlived his usefulness. Either path seemed to lead to death. That night, Gaius dreamed of his childhood in the Suburra, of the simple life he had led before ambition brought him to the palace. He dreamed of his father, a freedman who had worked as a barber before him, who had always warned him that the wealthy and powerful were different from ordinary people. They don't see us as human beings, his father had said. To them, we're tools, and when a tool breaks or becomes inconvenient, you throw it away. When Gaius woke the next morning, he realized that his father had been preparing him for this moment his entire life. The Emperor's morning grooming session proceeded normally, with no indication that Commodus suspected anything unusual. He chatted about the gladiatorial games scheduled for the following week, complained about a senator who had been asking impertinent questions about imperial spending, and discussed his plans for a new statue that would dwarf the Colossus of Rhodes. But as Gaius worked, carefully shaving the Emperor's face with practiced strokes, he found himself studying Commodus in a new way, not as his employer or even his master, but as a target. He noticed the rhythm of the Emperor's breathing, the way his head tilted during the shaving process, the precise angle at which his throat was exposed. It would be so easy. One quick movement, a slight change in pressure, and the most powerful man in the world would bleed out in seconds. Gaius's hands were steady enough, his knowledge of anatomy precise enough, his access complete enough to end the Emperor's life before any guard could intervene. The realization terrified him, not because he was considering it, but because he was certain that Commodus was thinking the same thing. When the grooming session ended, the Emperor lingered in his chair, studying Gaius in the bronze mirror. Tell me, Commodus said casually, have you had any interesting visitors lately? Gaius's blood froze, but he managed to keep his voice steady. No, Caesar. I spend most of my time in the palace. The Emperor mused. That's curious, because I've received reports that a man matching your description was seen in conversation with someone in the forum yesterday evening. It was a lie. Gaius had not left the palace the previous evening, but it was clearly a trap. The Emperor was testing him, trying to provoke a reaction that would confirm his suspicions. I believe someone has given you incorrect information, Caesar, Gaius replied carefully. I can account for my whereabouts at any time if necessary. Commodus smiled, but it was the smile of a predator who had scented prey. I'm sure you can. Loyalty such as yours is rare in these times, Gaius. I hope you never give me reason to question it. As Gaius left the imperial chambers, he knew that his time was running out. The Emperor's suspicions were growing, and soon they would crystallize into action. Whether Quintus's offer was genuine or a trap, whether the conspiracy was real or imaginary, Gaius had to make a choice. He had until tomorrow morning to decide whether to die as a loyal servant or as a traitor to Rome. That evening, as he sat in his quarters, staring at the luxury that surrounded him, the silk sheets, the painted walls, the silver basin that had once seemed like symbols of his success, Gaius finally understood the true nature of his position. He wasn't the emperor's trusted barber. He was a hostage, kept comfortable and well-fed, but ultimately held captive by the very proximity to power that he had thought was his greatest achievement. Every morning, when he held that razor to Commodus's throat, he was demonstrating not his loyalty, but his helplessness. The emperor trusted him not because he was trustworthy, but because he was trapped. And tomorrow morning, like every morning before it, he would pick up his razor and perform his duties, knowing that each stroke might be his last. Each breath might be his final one. Each moment of service might be the prelude to his own execution. In the imperial palace of Rome, trust was just another word for vulnerability, and Gaius had volunteered to be the most vulnerable man in the empire. The question now was whether he would die as a victim of that vulnerability, or whether he would find the courage to transform it into something else entirely. The answer would come with the dawn. But as Gaius lay in his silk sheets, staring at the painted ceiling and listening to the distant sounds of the palace settling into night, he realized that the choice had already been made for him, not by Quintus, not by the emperor, but by the simple mathematics of power and survival in the imperial court. Tomorrow morning, he would discover whether 18 months of loyal service had earned him mercy, or whether his steady hands and sharp razor had marked him for the same fate as all his predecessors. In the darkness of his luxurious prison, Gaius closed his eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be a simple barber in the Suburra, cutting the hair of ordinary citizens who paid their few coins and went about their ordinary lives without fearing for their survival. That man seemed like a stranger now, as distant and unreachable as the stars beyond the palace walls. Dawn came to the Palatine Hill with the same golden light that had blessed Rome for 1,000 years, but for Gaius Antonius, it felt like the light of Judgment Day. His hands trembled as he prepared his tools with the same ritual precision he had maintained for 18 months. But now every implement seemed heavier. Every reflection in the polished bronze seemed sharper. The summons came at the usual time, a soft knock on his door from one of the imperial slaves, followed by the familiar words, "The Caesar requires your services." Gaius gathered his tools and made his way through the marble corridors of the palace, past the guards who nodded respectfully, past the servants who averted their eyes, past the courtiers who whispered in corners about matters that could reshape or destroy the empire. The walk seemed longer than usual, each step echoing off the walls like a countdown to an execution. When he entered the emperor's private chambers, Commodus was already waiting, seated in his chair with the patient stillness of a man who held absolute power over life and death. The morning light streaming through the windows highlighted the strong lines of his face, the cruel intelligence in his eyes, the casual confidence of someone who had never known fear because he was the source of fear for everyone around him. "Good morning, Gaius," the emperor said pleasantly. "Are you ready to begin?" "Yes, Caesar," Gaius replied, his voice steadier than he had expected. As he arranged his instruments and prepared the warm water, Gaius was acutely aware that this might be his last morning routine. Every detail seemed magnified: the scent of the lavender oil, the weight of the razor in his hand, the sound of the emperor's breathing, the feel of the marble floor beneath his feet. "You seem nervous this morning," Commodus observed as Gaius began applying the warm oil to his face. "Is something troubling you?" The question was casual, but Gaius could hear the undertone of suspicion. The emperor was watching him closely, evaluating every gesture, every expression, every hesitation. "I slept poorly, Caesar," Gaius answered truthfully. "Perhaps too much wine with my evening meal." "Ah yes, the wine," Commodus mused. "One of life's great pleasures, but also one of its great dangers. Too much, and a man makes foolish decisions. Too little, and he lacks the courage to make necessary ones. Gaius picked up his razor and tested its edge against his thumb, drawing a tiny bead of blood. The blade was perfect, sharp enough to split a hair, balanced enough to respond to the slightest pressure. It was a tool of precision, capable of the most delicate work or the most decisive action. "Steady hands," the Emperor commented, watching Gaius's preparations. "That's what I've always admired about you. Never a tremor, never a hesitation. The mark of a true professional." "Thank you, Caesar," Gaius replied, beginning the familiar ritual of applying lather to the Emperor's face. As he worked, Gaius found himself thinking about the conversation with Quintus 2 nights earlier. The man's offer echoed in his mind. Safe passage, a new identity, enough gold to live comfortably for the rest of his life, all in exchange for betrayal. But was it really betrayal? Or was it, as Quintus had claimed, an act of patriotism? Gaius had served in the palace long enough to see the Emperor's excesses, his paranoid rages, his casual cruelty toward anyone who might pose even a theoretical threat. How many loyal servants had died simply because they knew too much? How many competent administrators had been eliminated because their competence made them dangerous? The Emperor's face was now covered with lather, his eyes closed in apparent relaxation. This was the moment of ultimate vulnerability and ultimate trust. Commodus was completely at Gaius's mercy, protected only by the assumption that his barber valued his own life more than any cause or principle. Gaius raised the razor to the Emperor's throat and made the first careful stroke. The steel whispered against skin, removing lather and stubble with the practiced efficiency of countless mornings. But as Gaius worked, he became aware of a strange detachment, as if he were watching himself from outside his own body. His hands moved with their usual precision, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating angles and pressures, timing and consequences. One quick movement, a sudden increase in pressure, a deliberate slip of the hand. It would be over in seconds. "Tell me, Gaius," the Emperor said suddenly, his eyes still closed. "What do you think makes a man loyal?" The question was so unexpected that Gaius almost jerked the razor away from the Emperor's throat. His hand steadied just in time, continuing the careful strokes as if nothing had happened. I'm not sure I understand the question, Caesar." "Loyalty," Commodus repeated. "What motivates it? Fear? Gratitude? Love? Self-interest? I've been thinking about this question quite a lot lately." Gaius continued shaving, his movements automatic while his mind raced. Was this another test? Another trap? Or was the Emperor genuinely curious about the psychology of the man who held a blade to his throat every morning? "I suppose," Gaius said carefully, "that different men are motivated by different things. Some serve out of duty, others out of ambition. Some because they have no choice, others because they believe in something greater than themselves." "And which are you?" Commodus asked, opening his eyes to study Gaius's face in the bronze mirror. The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Gaius met the Emperor's gaze in the mirror, still working with the razor, still maintaining the steady rhythm of his craft. "I serve you, Caesar, because you have given me purpose and honor. You have raised me from obscurity and trusted me with your life every morning. That trust is worth more to me than gold or titles or any comfort this world might offer." It was the truth, or at least part of it. But even as he spoke the words, Gaius was aware of their inadequacy. His loyalty was real, but it was complicated by fear, by the knowledge of what happened to servants who lost the Emperor's favor, by the growing realization that his position was not a mark of trust, but a form of captivity. "Beautifully spoken," Commodus said, almost poetic, "but you avoided my question." Gaius paused in his shaving, the razor poised just below the Emperor's jaw. "Caesar, I asked which type of loyal man you are. You gave me a speech about duty and honor and trust, but you didn't tell me whether you serve me out of love, fear, gratitude, or calculation. The emperor's eyes in the mirror were intense, searching, dangerous. Gaius realized that this was the moment of truth, the test that would determine whether he lived or died, whether he remained a trusted servant or joined his predecessors, and whatever dark fate awaited those who failed to satisfy the emperor's suspicions. "If I must choose," Gaius said slowly, "I would say that I serve you out of recognition." "Recognition? Yes, Caesar. I recognize what you are, the most powerful man in the world, chosen by the gods to rule the greatest empire in history. I recognize my place in relation to that power, and I recognize the honor of being permitted to serve you. It's not love, because love implies equality, and we are not equals. It's not fear, because fear implies hostility, and I bear you no ill will. It's not even gratitude, because gratitude implies that you owe me nothing in return. It's recognition of reality, of the natural order, of my proper place in the world." Commodus was quiet for a long moment, considering this answer. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of surprise. "That may be the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years." Gaius resumed his shaving, working around the emperor's mouth and chin with delicate precision. The most dangerous part was over. The throat was clean, smooth, perfect. Now came the finishing touches, the attention to detail that marked the difference between competent work and artistry. "Honesty is a rare quality in the palace," Commodus continued. "Most people tell me what they think I want to hear. They praise my wisdom when I'm being foolish. They applaud my mercy when I'm being cruel. They celebrate my victories when I'm obviously failing. It's refreshing to meet someone who understands the actual nature of our relationship." Gaius applied oil to the emperor's freshly shaved face, massaging it gently into the skin. His work was nearly complete. Another morning successfully navigated. Another day of life earned through skill and careful words. "There is, however, one problem with your analysis," Commodus said as Gaius began cleaning his tools. Gaius's hand stilled. "Caesar, you say you recognize reality, the natural order, your proper place in the world. But recognition implies understanding, and I'm not sure you truly understand your situation." The emperor stood up from his chair and walked to the window, his back to Gaius. For a moment, his silhouette against the morning light made him look almost godlike, a figure of such authority and power that the very air seemed to bend around him. "Your place in my household," Commodus continued, "is not determined by your skill as a barber, though you are quite skilled. It's not determined by your loyalty, though I believe your loyalty is genuine. It's determined by your usefulness, and usefulness has an expiration date." Gaius felt the familiar chill of fear, but also something else, a kind of clarity, as if a fog he hadn't even known was there had suddenly lifted. "I understand, Caesar." "Do you?" Commodus turned from the window, his eyes sharp and penetrating. "Then you understand that every morning when you hold that razor to my throat, you're not just demonstrating your loyalty, you're demonstrating your vulnerability, because the moment I decide you know too much, or that your presence poses any kind of risk, that razor will find its way to your own throat." "Yes, Caesar, I understand. And you understand that there's nothing personal in this? That I bear you no ill will, that I actually rather like you, but that personal feelings are luxuries that emperors cannot afford?" "Yes, Caesar." Commodus nodded approvingly. "Good. Then we understand each other perfectly." He returned to his chair and gestured for Gaius to continue with his grooming routine. There was still hair to trim, still oils to apply, still the dozens of small details that transformed the emperor from a man into a symbol worthy of worship. As Gaius worked, he found himself thinking about the conversation with a strange sense of relief. The pretense was over. The comfortable illusion that he was a trusted confidant, a valued member of the imperial household, had been stripped away to reveal the truth underneath. He was a temporary convenience, kept alive only as long as he remained useful and trustworthy. But knowledge, even terrible knowledge, was still power of a sort. Now that he understood the rules of the game, he could play it more effectively. He could stop hoping for permanent security and start planning for survival. He could stop thinking of himself as a loyal servant and start thinking of himself as what he had always been, a prisoner with privileges. "There's one more thing," the Emperor said as Gaius put the finishing touches on his appearance. "Caesar, that man who visited you 2 nights ago, Quintus Fabius Maximus, I believe he called himself." Gaius's blood turned to ice. "Caesar, Oh, don't bother denying it," Commodus said pleasantly. "I have eyes and ears throughout the palace. Nothing happens here without my knowledge. The question is not whether he visited you, but what you intend to do about his proposition." Gaius set down his comb with hands that were no longer quite steady. "I told him I wasn't interested." "Did you?" The Emperor's smile was genuinely amused. How refreshing. Most people would have at least pretended to consider his offer, if only to buy time to think. "I don't need time to think, Caesar. My loyalty is not for sale, even when the price is your life." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications and dangers. Gaius realized that this was the real test, the moment that would determine his fate. Not his skill with a razor, not his discretion about palace gossip, but his response to an offer of betrayal. "Especially then," Gaius replied. Commodus studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you mean that, which creates an interesting problem. Caesar, Quintus and his associates are not the type to accept rejection gracefully. They'll either try to coerce you into cooperation, or they'll eliminate you as a potential witness to their conspiracy. Either way, your life is now in danger from sources other than me." Gaius felt a chill of understanding. The Emperor was right. By refusing to cooperate with the conspiracy, he had made himself a target. Quintus couldn't afford to leave him alive with knowledge of the plot, regardless of his loyalty to the Emperor. "What would you have me do, Caesar?" "Nothing," Commodus replied. "Continue your duties as usual. Speak to no one about this conversation. Act as if nothing has changed. And when they come for me?" The Emperor's smile was cold and predatory. "They won't get the chance. You see, Gaius, while you were demonstrating your loyalty by refusing their offer, you were also demonstrating your usefulness by giving me information about their plans. That's a form of service that goes beyond simply being my barber." Gaius began to understand. "You want me to be a spy. I want you to be exactly what you are, my barber, who happens to be in a position to observe and report on the activities of those who wish me harm. It's a natural extension of your current duties. And if I refuse?" Commodus's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew darker. "Then you would no longer be useful to me. And we've already discussed what happens to people who are no longer useful." It wasn't really a choice, and they both knew it. Gaius could serve as the Emperor's agent within the conspiracy, or he could die. There was no third option, no middle ground, no possibility of simply walking away from the situation he had stumbled into. "I understand, Caesar. What do you need me to do?" "For now, nothing. Wait for them to contact you again, and they will. When they do, pretend to reconsider their offer. Show interest, ask questions, gather information. Learn who is involved, what their plans are, when they intend to act. And then you report back to me, and we decide how to proceed." Gaius nodded, though his mind was reeling with the implications of what he was agreeing to. He was no longer just a barber who happened to overhear state secrets. He was now an active participant in the deadly game of imperial politics, a spy whose survival depended on his ability to deceive men who killed for a living. "One more thing," Commodus said as Gaius prepared to leave. "If you betray me, if you actually join their conspiracy or feed them false information, your death will not be quick or clean. Do we understand each other?" "Perfectly, Caesar." As Gaius left the imperial chambers that morning, he carried with him not just his barber's tools, but the weight of a terrible new responsibility. He was now a double agent in a conspiracy against the most powerful man in the world, and his life depended on playing both sides with perfect precision. Over the following days, Gaius waited for Quintus to make contact again, but the palace seemed to have returned to its normal rhythm. He performed his morning duties with the emperor, who gave no sign that anything had changed between them. The conversations during grooming sessions remained casual. Discussions of gladiatorial games, complaints about senators, observations about the weather. But Gaius was now listening with different ears, analyzing every word for intelligence value, cataloging every name mentioned, every plan discussed. He was learning to think like a spy, to see patterns and connections that he had previously ignored. The emperor, for his part, seemed to be testing Gaius's newfound role as an intelligence asset. He would mention certain names or plans in passing, then observe Gaius's reactions. He would ask seemingly innocent questions about conversations Gaius might have overheard in the palace corridors. He was teaching his barber to be an agent, one lesson at a time. The lessons were subtle but effective. Gaius learned to remember details with perfect accuracy, to distinguish between important information and casual gossip, to recognize the significance of seemingly minor changes in routine or behavior. He discovered that he had a natural aptitude for this work. Perhaps the same attention to detail that made him a skilled barber also made him effective at gathering intelligence. But the strain was enormous. Every conversation became a performance, every interaction a potential test. Gaius found himself analyzing his own words and actions, second-guessing his responses, constantly aware that he was walking a tightrope between competing loyalties and deadly consequences. The contact from Quintus finally came on a rainy Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after their first meeting. Gaius returned to his quarters to find the man waiting in the shadows near his door, his presence announced only by the soft rustle of fabric and the faint scent of expensive perfume. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten our appointment," Quintus said quietly. "I've been thinking about what you said," Gaius replied, trying to project the right mixture of uncertainty and interest. "And I want to know more about the plan, about the people involved, about my own safety if I agree to help." Quintus smiled, and Gaius could see the satisfaction in his eyes. The conspirator believed he was winning, that the barber's resistance was crumbling under the pressure of fear and self-interest. "Those are reasonable questions," Quintus said, "but they require more detailed answers than I can provide standing in a corridor. There are others you need to meet, others who can explain the full scope of what we're attempting." "When?" "Tomorrow night. There's a villa in the hills outside Rome, owned by a man who shares our concerns about the emperor's leadership. We'll gather there to discuss the details." Quintus gave him precise directions to the villa, along with a password that would identify him to the guards. As he prepared to leave, he paused and placed a hand on Gaius's shoulder. "You're making the right choice," he said. "History will remember you as a patriot." After Quintus disappeared into the rainy night, Gaius sat in his quarters and tried to process what he had learned. The conspiracy was larger and more organized than he had imagined. There were multiple participants, safe houses, established security procedures. This wasn't the work of a few disgruntled senators. It was a sophisticated operation with resources and planning. The next morning's grooming session with the emperor took on a new significance. As Gaius worked with his razor and oils, he quietly reported what he had learned, describing Quintus's appearance and manner, the location of the villa, the password and security arrangements. "Excellent work," Commodus said when Gaius finished his report. "You're developing quite a talent for this sort of thing. What do you want me to do at the meeting, Caesar?" "Listen, observe, learn who is involved and what they're planning, but don't commit to anything specific. Tell them you need more time to consider the risks." And if they pressure me to make a decision? The Emperor's smile was cold. Then you'll discover how good an actor you really are. That evening, Gaius made his way through the hills outside Rome, following roads that became progressively narrower and more isolated as he traveled away from the city. The villa was exactly where Quintus had said it would be, a modest but well-maintained estate surrounded by olive groves and vineyards, the kind of property that belonged to someone with money but not ostentatious wealth. The guards at the gate were professional and alert, checking his identity and password before escorting him to the main house. Inside, he found himself in a comfortable dining room where a dozen men were gathered around a table laden with food and wine. Gaius recognized some of the faces: senators, wealthy merchants, military officers. These were not desperate revolutionaries or wild-eyed fanatics. They were members of Rome's elite, men with fortunes and reputations to protect, men who would not risk everything unless they believed the stakes were enormous. Quintus made the introductions, identifying Gaius as our friend from the palace, without mentioning his specific role. The others nodded politely, but didn't seem particularly interested in learning more about him. To them, he was simply a tool, a source of information and access, not a person worthy of their attention or respect. The conversation that followed was both fascinating and terrifying. These men spoke of the Emperor with a casual contempt that would have been suicidal if overheard by the wrong people. They discussed his mental instability, his financial irresponsibility, his alienation of key military commanders and provincial governors. They painted a picture of an empire on the brink of collapse, held together only by inertia and the reluctance of potential rivals to make the first move. "The question," said a distinguished senator named Marcus Aurelius Cleander, "is not whether Commodus must be removed, but when and how." "The timing is crucial," agreed a military officer whose scarred hand spoke of years of combat experience. "We need to act before he does something that triggers a civil war, but we also need to ensure that we have a viable successor ready to take power immediately. And that's where our friend here becomes invaluable," Quintus said, gesturing toward Gaius. "With his access to the Emperor's private chambers, we can ensure that our timing is perfect." All eyes turned to Gaius, and he felt the weight of their expectations. These men were offering him a place in history, a chance to help shape the future of the Roman Empire. But they were also asking him to commit the ultimate betrayal, to murder the man who trusted him with his life every morning. "I understand the importance of timing," Gaius said carefully, "but I need to know more about the plan itself. How exactly do you intend to remove the Emperor?" The military officer leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The beauty of your position is that you have the perfect opportunity. Every morning, you hold a blade to his throat. All it would take is one quick movement, one moment of decisive action. But what about the guards? The consequences?" "We've thought of that," Cleandus said. "The guards respect you, trust you. If you immediately claimed that the Emperor had been attacked by an intruder, that you had tried to defend him but arrived too late, they would believe you, especially if we planted evidence to support that story. And afterward, you would be a hero," Quintus said, "the loyal servant who tried to save his master's life. You would be rewarded, honored, protected. You would never have to worry about your safety or your future again." It was a seductive vision. Gaius as a hero rather than a murderer, rewarded rather than punished, celebrated rather than hunted. But he could also see the flaws in their reasoning, the assumptions that might prove fatal if they were wrong. What if the guards don't believe me? What if the investigation reveals the truth? Then you'll be no worse off than you are now, the military officer said bluntly. Commodus is already suspicious of you. How long do you think it will be before he decides you know too much? You're a dead man walking, Gaius. We're offering you a chance to die as a patriot instead of a victim. The conversation continued for another hour, covering details of timing, logistics, and contingencies. By the time it ended, Gaius had a comprehensive understanding of the conspiracy and his role in it. He also had a much clearer picture of the men who were asking him to commit murder in the name of patriotism. They were intelligent, well-connected, and utterly ruthless. They had convinced themselves that they were saving Rome, but Gaius could see that they were primarily interested in saving themselves. They feared that Commodus's instability would eventually threaten their own positions and fortunes, and they were willing to commit any crime to prevent that outcome. As he rode back to Rome through the darkness, Gaius found himself thinking about loyalty, patriotism, and the price of survival in a world where power was the only currency that mattered. He had learned enough to destroy the conspiracy, but he had also learned enough to understand why it existed. The emperor was everything the conspirators claimed: unstable, cruel, dangerous to anyone who served him. But he was also the legitimate ruler of Rome, chosen by the gods and confirmed by the Senate. To betray him would be to betray not just a man, but the entire structure of imperial authority. Yet to remain loyal to him was to remain complicit in his crimes, to enable his destruction of anyone who threatened his paranoid fantasies of absolute security. There were no good choices, only different forms of damnation. The next morning's grooming session with the emperor took place in an atmosphere of deadly anticipation. As Gaius worked with his razor, he quietly reported everything he had learned at the villa meeting: the names of the conspirators, their timeline, their methods, their contingency plans. Commodus listened with the focused attention of a general receiving intelligence about enemy troop movements. He asked precise questions about details and personalities, building a comprehensive picture of the threat against him. "Fascinating," he said when Gaius finished his report. "They want you to kill me during a grooming session, then claim it was an assassination by an unknown intruder." "Yes, Caesar, and they believe this plan will work." "They seem confident, Caesar. They've thought through many of the details." The emperor was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "Tell me, Gaius, what did you think of their arguments? Do you believe I'm the monster they claim I am?" It was perhaps the most dangerous question the emperor had ever asked him. A wrong answer could mean instant death, but even a right answer might be seen as calculated flattery. "I think, Caesar, that you are what the empire has made you. The burden of absolute power would corrupt any man, and the isolation of absolute authority would drive any man to paranoia. You are neither better nor worse than any emperor who has faced the same pressures and temptations." A diplomatic answer, Commodus observed, but not untrue. Power does corrupt, and paranoia is the price of survival in this position. The question is whether those corruptions make me unfit to rule. Only you can answer that question, Caesar. Can I? The emperor's laugh was bitter. I'm hardly objective about my own fitness for power, but perhaps that's not the relevant question anyway. Perhaps the relevant question is whether removing me would actually improve anything, or whether it would simply replace one set of problems with another. Gaius continued his work in silence, sensing that the emperor was working through thoughts that had been troubling him for some time. "These conspirators," Commodus continued, "they speak of serving Rome, of saving the empire from my excesses. But what they really want is to replace me with someone more amenable to their interests. They don't care about the people of Rome, or the stability of the provinces, or the security of the borders. They care about their own wealth and influence." "Perhaps that's true, Caesar." "Oh, it's definitely true. I know these men, Gaius. I've watched them for years, seen how they operate, observed their priorities. They're not patriots, they're opportunists. And if they succeed in removing me, they'll simply install a puppet emperor who will serve their interests while they continue to loot the treasury and exploit the provinces." The emperor was building toward something, Gaius realized. This wasn't just a philosophical discussion about the nature of power and corruption. This was a test, perhaps the final test of Gaius's loyalty and usefulness. Which brings us, Commodus said, to the question of what you intend to do about their offer. Gaius set down his razor and met the emperor's eyes directly. What would you have me do, Caesar? I would have you make your own choice, based on your own judgment and your own values. Not because I command it, and not because they threaten you, but because you believe it's the right thing to do. It was an impossible demand, to make a free choice in a situation where all choices led to death, to find moral clarity in a world where morality itself had been corrupted by power and survival. But as Gaius looked into the emperor's eyes, he realized that Commodus was offering him something that no one else could: the truth. Not the comfortable lies of loyalty and honor, not the seductive promises of patriotism and reward, but the brutal truth about power, corruption, and the price of survival in imperial Rome. I choose, Gaius said quietly, to serve Rome, not because you command it, and not because they threaten me, but because I believe that stability, however imperfect, is better than chaos, however well-intentioned. Even if that means serving a monster, Commodus nodded slowly, as if Gaius's answer had confirmed something he had suspected all along. Then here is what you will do, the emperor said. You will return to the conspirators and tell them you've decided to help them. You will participate in their planning, gain their complete trust, learn every detail of their operation, and then, when they're ready to act, you will give me the signal that allows me to destroy them all. And the signal? When you hold the razor to my throat that morning, you will draw one drop of blood, nothing more, just a tiny nick that could be explained as an accident. But I will know that the time has come. Gaius understood. He would become the instrument of the conspiracy's destruction, the agent who would lead them into a trap from which none would escape. It was a role that would damn him in the eyes of history, if history ever learned the truth. But it was also the only path that led to his own survival. I understand, Caesar. Good. And Gaius? Yes, Caesar. When this is over, when the conspiracy has been crushed and the conspirators have paid the price for their betrayal, you will disappear. New identity, new life. Enough gold to live comfortably in some distant province where no one knows your name or your story. It was a promise of redemption, of a chance to escape the deadly game of imperial politics and return to the simple life he had once known. But it was also an acknowledgement that he would never be safe in Rome again, that his service as a double agent would mark him as a target for anyone seeking revenge against the emperor. Thank you, Caesar. Don't thank me yet, Commodus said grimly. You still have to survive long enough to collect on that promise. Over the following weeks, Gaius played his role with the skill of a professional actor. He met regularly with the conspirators, participated in their planning sessions, provided intelligence about the emperor's routines and security arrangements. He even helped them refine their plan, suggesting modifications that would make their story more believable while secretly ensuring that their trap would be easier to spring. The conspirators welcomed his suggestions with enthusiasm, pleased to have such a knowledgeable and committed ally. They began treating him as a full partner in their enterprise, sharing information about their other operations and introducing him to additional members of their network. What they didn't realize was that every piece of information they shared with him was being passed along to the emperor. Every name was being added to a list of targets. Every detail was being used to construct a comprehensive map of the conspiracy that would allow Commodus to destroy not just the immediate threat, but the entire network of disloyal citizens who posed a danger to his rule. The psychological strain of this double life was enormous. Gaius found himself lying constantly, not just to the conspirators, but to everyone around him. He couldn't trust anyone, couldn't relax his guard for even a moment, couldn't show any sign of the stress that was slowly eating away at his sanity. He began to understand why his predecessors as imperial barber had all died so quickly. It wasn't just that the emperor grew suspicious of them. It was that the position itself was unsustainable for any extended period. The combination of constant fear, absolute isolation, and the need to maintain perfect composure while holding steel to the throat of the most dangerous man in the world would eventually break anyone. But Gaius persevered, driven by the promise of eventual escape and the knowledge that his survival depended on completing his mission successfully. He learned to compartmentalize his thoughts, to separate his role as conspirator from his role as imperial agent, to maintain his sanity by focusing on the technical details of his work rather than its moral implications. The end came on a cold morning in late November, exactly 3 months after Quintus had first approached him with the offer of betrayal. The conspirators had finalized their plans and chosen their date. They would act during the next morning's grooming session, when the emperor would be at his most vulnerable and the palace would be at its quietest. As Gaius prepared his tools that final morning, his hands were steadier than they had been in months. The uncertainty was over. The waiting was finished. The moment of decision had arrived. In a few minutes, he would either complete his mission successfully or die in the attempt. The emperor was already waiting in his chambers, seated in his chair with the patient stillness that had become so familiar over the months of Gaius' service. But this morning there was something different in his eyes, a sharp alertness that suggested he was fully aware of what was about to unfold. "Good morning, Gaius," Commodus said pleasantly. "Are you ready to begin?" "Yes, Caesar," Gaius replied, beginning his usual preparations. As he worked, applying oil to the emperor's face and preparing the lather, Gaius was acutely aware that this might be his last morning routine. If something went wrong, if the emperor's counterplans failed, if the conspirators somehow detected his betrayal, he would be dead within the hour. But as he picked up his razor and moved it toward the emperor's throat, Gaius felt a strange sense of peace. For months, he had been trapped between competing loyalties and deadly consequences. Now, finally, he could act decisively, could choose his own fate rather than simply react to the choices of others. The blade whispered against the emperor's skin, removing lather and stubble with the practiced efficiency of countless mornings. But this time, as Gaius worked around the emperor's jaw, he allowed the razor to bite just slightly deeper than usual, drawing a single drop of bright red blood. "My apologies, Caesar," he said, dabbing away the blood with a cloth. "A small accident." "No matter," Commodus replied calmly. "These things happen." But in the emperor's eyes, Gaius could see acknowledgement and approval. The signal had been given, the trap was set, and within hours the conspiracy would be crushed with ruthless efficiency. As Gaius completed the shaving and began applying oil to the emperor's face, he could hear footsteps in the corridor outside, the sound of armed men moving into position, preparing for the arrests that would decapitate the conspiracy in a single coordinated strike. The conspirators who had trusted him, who had welcomed him into their circle, who had promised him wealth and honor and historical recognition, would soon discover that they had been betrayed by the very man they had tried to recruit. They would die cursing his name, damning him as the instrument of their destruction. But Gaius would live. He would collect the emperor's promised reward, assume his new identity, and disappear into the provinces, where he could finally escape the deadly game of imperial politics. It wasn't a noble ending, perhaps, but it was a living one. And in the brutal calculus of survival in Commodus's Rome, that was victory enough. As the emperor rose from his chair and prepared to meet the day that would see his enemies destroyed, Gaius cleaned his razor one final time and prepared to disappear forever into the shadows of history. His name would never appear in the official records, his story would never be told by the court historians, and his role in preserving the emperor's life would never be acknowledged by those who benefited from his sacrifice. But somewhere in a distant province, under a different name and with a different life, the man who had once been Gaius Antonius would remember these mornings in the imperial palace, these moments of perfect terror and perfect trust, these few minutes each day when he had held the fate of the Roman Empire in his steady, skilled hands. And perhaps, in the quiet moments before sleep claimed him in his new life, He would wonder if he had made the right choice, if loyalty to a monster was better than betrayal of an empire, if survival was worth the price he had paid for it. But those were questions for later, for the long years of exile and anonymity that awaited him. For now, he was simply a barber who had completed his work, a servant who had served his master faithfully, a man who had chosen survival over principle and lived to escape the consequences of that choice. In the marble halls of the imperial palace, the sound of marching feet grew louder as the emperor's guards moved to arrest the conspirators. Justice, imperial style, was about to be served, and Gaius Antonius, the barber who had held steel to Caesar's throat and chosen loyalty over revolution, gathered his tools and walked away from the most dangerous job in the Roman Empire, disappearing into a new life where no one would ever know what he had done or what he had sacrificed to survive. The razor was finally set aside, the emperor's throat was finally safe, and the man who had saved them both was finally free to become someone else entirely. Sleep peacefully, knowing that throughout history, there have always been those who chose the difficult path of loyalty over the easy path of betrayal, who served faithfully even when service meant danger, who protected those in power, not because power deserved protection, but because stability was preferable to chaos. In a world where trust was a luxury and survival was an art, some souls found the courage to choose the harder right over the easier wrong, to serve even when service meant sacrifice, to remain loyal even when loyalty meant living forever in the shadows. Close your eyes and rest, secure in the knowledge that even in the darkest chapters of history, there were those who understood that some duties transcend personal interest, some oaths survive temptation, and some forms of service honor both the servant and the served. The barber's blade has been cleaned and put away. The emperor's trust has been preserved, and the man who held both in his steady hands has found his way to peace at last.